Alright, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Pull this up. So with last week with Micah, we have hit the halfway mark. We are now approaching the latter half of the minor prophets. And we talked last week, of course, about Micah and the messages of prophecy, particularly of the fact that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. So now we get to the prophet Nahum, which in the People's Bible commentary, I try to say that 3 times in a row, they mention how a lot of folks, when they try to read through Nahum, they get bogged down by what's being talked about and just skip it, which is not something that I recommend, because there's a lot in there, and there's a lot to digest, but it's a lot. Of course, it's a lot of good stuff. Well, not necessarily for the intended audience, but we'll get there in a minute. So, like our custom that we've kind of set up here with our study, what, if any, background do we know about Nahum? Like very many of the minor prophets, very little. So Nahum is from Elkosh, and unlike several of the prophets before him, we have no idea where Elkosh could be. Excuse me. We're listed in a couple of the books that I read. There are possibly 3 locations that it could be in. The first one could be in Assyria. It could possibly be there. Another location possibility would be in Galilee, or maybe even in Judah. But we have no idea as to where specifically Elkosh is located. But Nahum tells us this right off the bat in verse 1 of his first chapter, that he is from Elkosh. Another tidbit about Nahum, the name Nahum means comfort, which, as we get to reading, learning a little bit more about what he's written down, it would seem a little ironic, considering the messages as I list here in the title up there, more destruction and judgment. So the idea that a prophet with the name that means comfort is talking a whole lot about this destruction and comfort, judgment stuff rather. And the last little background tidbit thing about Nahum is that he was in the 7th century BC. So that's basically around the time that he was around. What?
That was a long time ago.
It was. So then, like many of the prophets before him, Nahum speaks of impending judgment and destruction. So there have been various ones of the minor prophets that have had a wide variation of audiences as to who this destruction and judgment and all this lovely stuff is going to be happening to. 1 or 2 or more of the prophets have been just for the tribes in the north, for the northern kingdom. Some of them for the north and the south. Some of them including just the south. It just depends on where they are sent by God. As for Nahum, he is speaking to the city of Nineveh. Yes, the same Nineveh that Jonah was sent to. What?
I said, go figure. Their conversion didn't last long.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yep, and just a reminder about Nineveh, it is a capital of Assyria. So, and Assyria itself, we can recall, is very powerful and had many victims, and that includes Judah to the south. We remember the exact location is escaping me at the moment, but it's listed how the king Sennacherib, his envoy, is sent to the walls of Jerusalem, basically telling the people there to surrender to him, basically kind of threatening in somewhat of a smooth way, and also taunting the fact that has there been any god or any ruler that stood up while Sennacherib has been in power. So they're trying to get the people of Jerusalem to surrender to them so that they could conquer them. And that's when when an angel of the Lord comes down and strikes down several thousand of Sennacherib's army. But there's been other occasions as well that may or may not be thinking of. But like I said, Assyria kind of is one of Judah's rivals, and a very fierce one at that. And like I said, we've talked about how destructive and violent they can be. But interestingly enough, Nineveh is not the audience for Nahum's book. Certainly they are the subject of it, but the people whom he is writing for, this comes again from the People's Bible Commentary. The Lord was speaking to Nineveh mainly for Judah's benefit. What that means is that the book wasn't necessarily for Nineveh's ears directly, but it was for Judah to hear of what would come about their enemy. The idea that Yahweh personally will bring an end to Assyria and wipe Nineveh completely off the map. We've talked about this before, how the northern tribes, how the northern kingdom, they were brought into exile and never heard from them again. Similar situation to what's going to happen to Nineveh. And of course it ultimately does. Any questions or comments thus far about Nahum? Right, so seeing none. Gonna keep rolling here. I thought it was a little interesting tidbit right off the bat in chapter 1, verse 1. I mentioned that Nahum lists where he's from, which is something that most to all of the prophets do in some way, shape, or form. But also notice what he says, an oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. So we've kind of heard different definitions of oracles over the years. So the oracle that's listed here means lifted up, or something that must be lifted up. Yeah, so, and according to Lutheran Study Bible, oracles were most often spoken against a foreign power. So the fact that there's this heavy burden on Nahum's shoulders that he is going to be delivering this, this word of judgment to the people of Nineveh. But unlike with Jonah before him, we don't have anything listed of him running away. And this is something, and this is a prophet once again that is using that more, I say poetic prose, not poetic that we think of poetic nowadays, but again, it's that Hebrew poetry that was there, instead of the narrative a la Jonah. Yeah, like I said, something interesting that was listed there. The whole thing with him saying that it was a vision. A vision, again, this comes from the People's Bible Commentary, was used as a technical term for receiving a message from the Lord. So, it's possible it wasn't necessarily a vision like we think of, or we read about several of the folks of the Bible receiving a vision. It's just simply receiving a message from Yahweh God. Alright, so fair warning, this may seem a little bit short, but so is Nahum at 3 chapters. Before we even delve into the last bit here that I wanted to talk about, wanted to kind of talk about now. Obviously, this has nothing to do with what Nahum himself wrote, because this was not something that he actually wrote down. It was added later as our Bibles were formed and put together and all of such. The headings, though, that are listed here, look in each of the headings that exist for each of the chapters. First one, starting with verse 2 of chapter 1, God's wrath against Nineveh. Second, the destruction of Nineveh. And the third, woe to Nineveh. So, like I said, this has nothing to do with what Nahum himself wrote or anything of that sort, because back then they were not busy writing chapter numbers and verse numbers and headings and all of that sort like our modern Bibles have done. But again, just that kind of thing of, this is really bad here for Nineveh. This is really bad stuff that's going to happen here. Yeah, so the first chapter, just to kind of sum that up in a sense, is obviously the heading, God's wrath against Nineveh. It gives the reasons. Of course, God is God. He can do as he pleases, and we know that he is right and just. But the reasons, if you will, of why this is going to happen to Nineveh. Verse 7, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. Just a kind of brief little word of gospel in a book that seems to be very heavy with law. Yeah, so kind of that contrast that's there is that, yeah, this destruction's going to come. This is going to be bad stuff here, but also that assurance that Yahweh is going to take care of those who do take refuge in him. Obviously, a lot of the folks in Nineveh have not done that, which is why this destruction and judgment is coming. But nonetheless, that brief word there is there to remind us that those who do take refuge in the Lord, though all these other things are going on, he knows who they are. And just kind of overall, the first chapter kind of has that overarching theme of Nineveh's fall will be fierce. Well, really, it's the whole book, but chapter 1 especially. And then chapter 2 really kind of talks about the destruction, how bad it will be, how bad this destruction is going to be. And then toward the end of chapter 2, it's pretty much right at the end of chapter 2. So this is where I'm talking about here at the end of our sheet here. Near the end of this book, there are 2 taunt songs that Nahum uses against this city. First off, we need to be absolutely clear here of what these songs are not. So the taunt songs, they are not to ridicule a fallen enemy. So again, this comes from the commentary. This is not to ridicule Nineveh. This is to condemn this. Again, from the commentary, this is to condemn the sinful pride of Nineveh. So this is not a taunt in the same way that we would think of just ridiculing them, but it's to condemn their pride, to condemn all that that's going on. And certainly with the first one that's listed here in chapter 2, verse 11, starting at verse 11, where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb? The lion tore a net for his cubs, and strangled prey for his lionesses. He filled his caves with prey, and his dens with torn flesh. Verse 13, Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. So, in the time that Nahum is prophesying here, the lion, so Assyria and Nineveh is being compared to that of a lion, and how prideful that they, the Assyrians, are of themselves. And also I read in one of the commentaries that the people of Assyria truly loved that image of the lion, how big and powerful they were and all that, and they had that image everywhere. So now to condemn all that pride that they had for themselves, thinking they were the greatest thing ever. Now, that language in verse 11 of where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb. The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lionesses. He filled his caves with prey, and his dens were with torn flesh. Again, referencing of how horrific the Assyrians treated their enemies. I kind of hinted at that when we talked about Jonah. But just that idea of now they are not going to be able to do such a thing, and they are having this blown up in their faces. Yeah, so that's the first comparison here. And I mentioned that there's two. There's actually three that I totally... Yep. The things that happen when you prep for two classes at the same time, you miss things. Yep. So I'll list off the one that I had originally listed as the second one, and then I'll briefly touch on the other one that I missed. So this is chapter 3 now of Nahum. So chapter 3, verse 8, starting there. Are you better than... I never did find out how to pronounce this correctly. Thebes or Thebes, one of the two, that sat by the Nile with water around her rampart a sea, and water her wall. Cush was her strength, Egypt too, and that without limit, and the Libyans were her helpers. Yet she became an exile, she went into captivity. Her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street, for her honored men lots were cast, and all her great men were bound in chains. You also will be drunken, you will go into hiding, you will seek a refuge from the enemy. All your fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, your troops are withered in your midst. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. And thus it continues after that. So the city that Nahum is listing here in this second taunt song is Thebes of the this is an Egyptian city. This is a capital of ancient Egypt. If you ever get the chance to look up that, I don't necessarily have the time to go completely into detail because there's a lot of things that happen, like how it came to be, how it came into power, and then how they eventually fell. I totally recommend looking into that, just to kind of give more of that context there. But basically what Nahum is saying, that in the same way that Thebes was full of itself and considered itself infallible, so would happen to Nineveh. Because Thebes and Nineveh think they are the top dog, they are infallible, like I mentioned, and the harder they will fall. So yeah, so those are the two that I originally was going to be touching on. The one that I missed was up in chapter 3, verse 4. And for all the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings, and peoples with her charms. Brief little word there. So it's listed at the on my Lutheran Study Bible here. So Nineveh's victimization, words are hard tonight, sorry about that, of other nations is compared to harlotry and sorcery. So Nahum may be alluding to the cult of Ishtar, the special goddess of Nineveh, whose rituals contain explicit references to sexual activity. Again, that comes from the notes in the Lutheran Study Bible. But once again, these all kind of have the same message of, you think you're so great, you think that you are the greatest city, the greatest thing around here, and that you did all this on your own. You're in for it. You are in for what's coming. Alright, I know, like I said, that was pretty short, but are there any questions about Nahum? And hopefully I wasn't rambling too much. Like I said, it's a pretty heavy and hefty read, even though it's only 3 chapters long. I do recommend going through and reading the entire book, just to kind of get that context of the destruction that's going to happen to Nineveh, as well as, again, the context with all these taunt songs, if you want to call them that Nahum is doing there.